Welcome to the Litigation Psychology Podcast, brought to you by Courtroom Sciences. Dr. Steve Wood. Exciting topic coming up today. I always enjoy talking about this, and who better to join me and to talk about social media in the courtroom is Sean Murphy. Sean is a practice leader of the CSI Critical Communications Department, and Sean and I have written on social media before. So, Sean, how are you?
How are you doing today, Steve? Thanks for having me.
I'm good. And then Brent Turman. Brent Turman is from Bell Nunnally. Brent's been on the podcast a few times too. I always enjoy talking to Brent because he always brings a different twist to the topics, because Brent, you do a lot of entertainment law and a lot of things in the media, and you rub elbows with a lot of people in the media. So you're always fun to have on as far as getting your opinion. So how are you today?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, today I want to talk about social media in the courtroom, social media outside the courtroom, and just really dive deep into all the different factors that are going on with social media and how that plays out. But I want to talk about, first and foremost, this kind of grew out of a conversation Sean and I had about cameras in the courtroom, and Sean, I want you to talk a little bit about Trump and Trump's recent litigation that's going on, and kind of the battle that's been going on as cameras in the courtroom, and really talk a little bit about advantages, disadvantages, who wants them, who doesn't, and just dive into that.
Sure. Well, I mean, there's a state case in Georgia where cameras are allowed. So it's going to happen there once that trial occurs. The debate is occurring right now in terms of the federal trials that he's facing, and the one in Washington, where he's saying, the federal rules are you can't have cameras in the courtroom. There have been prominent prosecutors, Neil Katyal, Andrew Weissman, calling for cameras in the courtroom, saying that the rules should be changed for this because there needs to be daylight around this trial so that people can see the evidence for themselves, right, and see the truth firsthand. Trump recently got on board with that, and his team filed their own papers to have that trial televised. And he's saying in his rallies that he wants them televised too. But I think what you have here is two different sets of objectives. I think on the one hand, you've got good and well-intentioned prosecutors who think that if people will objectively look at this evidence and arrive at the same conclusion that they expect a fair jury to arrive at. What they're not taking into account is, I think, several things. One is Trump's ability to manipulate public opinion. And you see how he's doing this in his New York case. He shows up for trial on the days when he wants to change the headline, right? When he wants the stories to be about his statement or his conduct in the courtroom or anything but the evidence that's being presented that day. So even without a camera in the courtroom, he's very skilled at managing the media around what's going on with his trial. With cameras in the courtroom, you still have that. Plus, you have the situation where, I would say people with biases can hear the same information and hear it in a way that confirms their bias, right? So it's not an objective jury that will be watching. It's an army of people, and particularly in his case, who are already biased to his point of view and his position. And they're going to look for evidence and going to cherry pick evidence that supports that, and use that in all of the channels that they have in social media to make that seem like that's the story, that's the evidence. Now, Trump himself is saying, yeah, let's have cameras in the courtroom because I want the light of day and all of that. But I think what he realizes is that it's not going to happen, that, it would be unprecedented for cameras to be in a federal courtroom. So what he is putting into question is then the fairness of the process. Will justice be done? And so that, I think, is what's happening there. It's gamesmanship around having cameras in the courtroom. And no matter what happens, cameras or not, there's going to be a litigation communication strategy to make sure that the court of public opinion is being influenced in one way.
I think that's interesting. We had talked before about the Brian Kohberger case out of Idaho, where he's currently on trial for 4 murders. And one of the things, the battles that's being fought right now is prosecution, defense don't want cameras in the courtroom. Media kind of wants cameras in the courtroom because they want the First Amendment right to be able to show what's going on in there. And then the judge is kind of begrudgingly keeping the cameras in the courtroom, but he's upset with the way stuff is being used in social media, and that goes to your point, I think, Sean, about how things can be cut and used and misconstrued or used in a certain way to build around a base. Brent, and I want to talk to you a little bit about, I mean, I think you've had some experiences before where you've had cases that almost got cameras in the courtroom. Have you had experiences? What's been your experience with cameras in the courtroom, trying to defend a case with that kind of looming over you?
So a couple of things, even if you don't have cameras in the courtroom, a lot of times, depending on who you represent, whether it's a prominent figure, a prominent company, a team, anything like that, there are eyeballs on you, right? When you file something with the district clerk and it goes up there on Pacer, people see it. It is part of the media. And so that's part of the strategy. Whether you have cameras physically on you or not, people are watching. And you may also, we talked earlier, have those two wars, right? The public opinion and then obviously the legal issues, right? Sometimes the public opinion is very important for that client's bottom line, their well-being, their business, right? And so a lot of times, there are times where you're going to include language, include phrases, include arguments in your motion that you think might get picked up by the media. You think tell the story. And it may not be the things that are crucially legally necessary for that particular motion, but you want to make sure they get in there. And then with we dodged cameras in the media one. We talked about it before, the 50 Shades of Grey case, where we strategically decided to go under the radar. And it would have been a spectacle. But it was actually the trial happened the same week as the Chris Kyle American Sniper trial as well. So all eyes were over there and we were able to stay under the radar for our client's benefit.
Yeah, I think that's interesting that you bring up about just the fact that that the petitions or complaints, the documentation might get out into the public sphere, that you have to put some thought behind, hey, if this gets out, what is this going to look like on Twitter or X or social media and just in general, right?
Yeah, you got to think about what's going to be in the Sports Business Journal the next day or whatever the appropriate trade is. Definitely, that needs to be a consideration. And you're not fully serving your clients if you aren't thinking about that.
And I don't want to delve too much and rehash kind of the Amber Heard, Johnny Depp thing, but Sean, I do want to kick it over to you, and I do want to get your opinion, Brent, on some of this, how the media can play an influence. I want to touch a kind of high level on it because I know we've done a podcast before about it, but just kind of how not only necessarily the media leading up to it, but what's going on during the trial and what's going on as far as how things are being positioned and, one side versus the other and how they're positioning that.
Yeah, so I think what we saw in that trial is that, Johnny Depp's team came fully prepared to use all of the levers that were available to them to manage public opinion around that trial. So, we've seen retrospective reports, for example, the one done by Bot Sentinel, that women who tweeted in support of Amber were attacked relentlessly. Twitter trolls would swarm the tweets of women who tweeted positively about Amber Heard and often used vulgar and threatening language. So there you saw, because that trial was televised and because they had clips to use, you saw certain testimony being highlighted and other testimony being pushed aside so that people wouldn't see it, right? And so, with a very savvy social media strategy, Depp's team was able to really influence the court of public opinion. And when you look at how influential social media is, I mean, Pew released a report yesterday that said that a third of adults between 18 and 29 get their news from TikTok. So that's a platform that uses, that relies on video, right? Other platforms like X and Facebook are down in terms of who gets their news from there, but it's still a substantial number of people. So, the issue there was in the Depp trials that he was on the offense, she was always on the defense. And it's like they were prepared on a day-to-day, hand-to-hand combat basis to put out the videos that supported, his position, his point of view, and depositioned her, kind of paint him more positively and pick out all the negative things that, occurred at her end on the trial and highlighting them to deflect from the negative testimony about him. Because if actually you look at the testimony about both of it, none of it's flattering, right? Yet, nonetheless, he came out of it, with his career somewhat, resuscitated and revived. And, she had to take a lower profile for a period of time. So a lot, in that case, as Brent is indicating, you're talking about two public figures whose livelihood relies on their reputation, right, and their brand.
Yeah, Brent, and like I said, that was an interesting case. I know there's been tons of podcasts on it. There's even a documentary on that, and even in that documentary, they touch a lot on the social media portion. Now everybody's become really savvy as far as true crime podcasts, true crime documentaries. So you have a lot of well-informed, well-intended people, but I think it goes back to what Sean had said too, is even these well-informed, well-intended people that watched the whole trial were very, very pro Johnny and very, very anti Amber. But I think it goes back to what Sean talks about, is there was this kind of narrative of if you said anything positive towards Amber, you were going to get shot down or you were going to get harassed. So I think a lot of people said, I don't want any part of that. So they just kind of stay out of it. But I guess I just kind of, from an attorney's perspective, thinking about being in a situation like that, I mean, is those are the things that you have to consider, or those are the things that you're thinking about, as you're progressing through trial? I mean, I know you're focusing on the trial, you're focusing on other things, but what is it you're also having to put back, and, how do you handle that social media as you're trying to focus on the case, but you also got to focus on the other stuff?
Yeah, you don't want it to be a distraction, and a lot of things were definitely sensationalized here. I don't know about your feeds. I saw a lot of poop emojis. I saw a lot of people talking about mega pints. I saw a lot of people imitating her, talking about her dog getting stung by a bee over and over and over. But with that, it's important to think about, I mean, the judge, they had their instructions and those aren't always followed. For example, one fact witness couldn't testify because she had been watching clips and summaries online leading up to it. With the rule, a fact witness can't be observing other testimony for, you think of reasons why that rule's there, right?
Yeah.
On top of that, too, it's important to remember, I don't want to make it selfish about the attorneys, but you are always on camera, right? I learned from a young age, the jury is always looking at you. When the other side is scoring points on cross-examination, you aren't vigorously taking notes and scrambling, like, how am I going to respond to this? You're being cool, calm, collected. You might even act like nothing's going on and you're maybe a little bored, right? Still respectful, but bored. And then also, it was very important, one thing, so I was on a panel last year with Chanley Painter from Court TV, who is amazing, by the way. And she said, she talked to the jurors afterwards, and their impression of the attorneys was really interesting. On Amber Heard's side, it was cold. It felt like nobody liked each other. And on Johnny Depp's side, you could feel the chemistry. They were happy to be in each other's presence. Like, you don't want to be too jokey. You need to don't take it lightly. But you could tell they enjoyed being around each other and they liked their client. All of those things play into it. And all those things, too, were highlighted on social media as well. I know some of those attorneys became celebrities after that case.
And that's what always fascinates me. I mean, depending on the case, I told you before we got on, I actually have Court TV on in the background watching another case with Chanley Painter on, actually. But I mean, I think it's interesting on some of these cases that sometimes the attorneys are the focal point, or they get, they get focus and visibility, and then other ones they don't. But I think, that is another interesting thing that I see, is sometimes the attorneys just get as much face time as what the clients do, So I think it goes back to your point, is always understanding that you're going to be on camera and that you could become part of it as well, part of the conversation. And to your point, some of these, like Jose Baez and those from other cases are now become commentators on different law programs based upon their trials and the media attention that it got. So, I think always thinking about that, but I want to go ahead, Sean.
I was going to say that, in her case, we talked about, I think before, what went wrong, but just one point about what she might have done. I read subsequent to the case that a lot of of the evidence that was allowed in her UK case was not allowed in the US case. And to the extent that it was, allowable by law, let's say, a strategy for her would be to put out that evidence in social media and other settings, to get that side of the story out. If she couldn't introduce it in the courtroom, as long as there was no, issue legally, she could have introduced it into the court of public opinion and influenced back, right? Had something to push back with.
And I think that's interesting. That's a good segue into what I want to talk about. We'll start with Brent on this one, but we're talking about documentaries. So there was a Johnny Depp Amber Heard documentary that was out that talked a lot about social media. Then at the tail end of that, there was discussion about some additional information that the jurors didn't see, which would have changed the perceptions. But I want to, there's several documentaries out there now. We had just talked that there, Take Care of Maya, that the Maya Kowalski case had just now finished with a $261 million verdict, 211 in compensatories and 50 million in punitives. And there was a documentary on that. I want to talk a little bit about how these documentaries sometimes can spin narratives as well too, that maybe you're not getting the full piece of the puzzle that you didn't get in the trial, but what it's doing though is kind of enraging or educating people, but in a more biased view. So Brent, I want to talk a little bit about that documentary and kind of what your thoughts are.
Yeah, definitely. And so I saw that documentary recently, and with it, my first career was in film and television. I know the power of a camera. I know the power of being the editor. There's probably more power there, right? And so you give me, for example, direct examination, cross-examination. I can make a 30-second clip making that person look like an angel or a devil, right? It all depends on what I want it to look like. So here we're talking about documentaries. A lot of times they're biased. Yeah, they are. Maybe that's on the viewer for assuming they're not going to be. You assume it's just, news because it's a documentary, not a narrative feature, right? But with that, a filmmaker has his or her vision and they are putting it out there, right? And so I think for these, obviously there was a purpose for creating that documentary, and there was a narrative and there was a message filmmakers wanted to get out there. And I think they did. It's a gut-wrenching film. Again, I saw it last week when you brought it to my attention. I heard it before, I hadn't seen it yet. It is a gut-wrenching film, and it'd be hard to leave watching that and have your opinion be right down the middle.
Yeah. And Sean, I mean, what we talk about how potential jurors and whether or not they've seen things ahead of time or whether or not they've seen tweets and posts and they're instructed to not look at any of those things. But I mean, from a realistic perspective, from a communications perspective, what kind of your thoughts on whether or not you can stay away from those or be open-minded after seeing any of that stuff?
Well, as we know, they're not supposed to, right? But we are inundated with information everywhere we go. And, people have their favorite sources of information. And also, it's not just what they may see directly, it's the people who they interact with and what they're seeing and what they're saying to them and the influence that others in their circle may have on them. So it is critically important to manage perceptions in the court of public opinion, to at least play for a tie. If you want that kind of neutral environment, that's ideal for a trial. So it's critically important, and that's why you have to have a litigation communication strategy as part of your trial strategy, especially in a high-profile case. You don't want to leave it to chance.
No, and I think it's important, and I don't want to push blame towards the defense on, from Johns Hopkins on that case. So, I mean, I guess the question is, Sean, going off, put you on the spot here a little bit. I mean, what are your thoughts as far as whether, if that documentary is out there and people have seen it, people have gotten opinions now and they're very strong, because if to what Brent said, you can't watch that and not be pissed off at the hospital. But if you watch the trial, there's a lot more nuance to it. There's a lot more information to it that's not necessarily portrayed in the documentary. So how do you handle that? I mean, is that something that you say, we know there's a documentary out there that doesn't shine a good light on us? Should we try to add additional information, or should we just say, let's not worry about it and move forward and hope that's not influential, because jurors aren't supposed to see it anyway, and anybody who would have saw the documentary is never making it on the panel?
Right. And so I think that in that case, I mean, in terms of the trial itself, like you said, who makes it onto the panel. But I think you might have, in case you need it, a strategy around depositioning the documentary, making it, positioning it as being biased, and why it's biased, and what information is missing from there, calling it into question. If it becomes, a point of contention, if it becomes something that is critical to your case, yeah, you need a strategy around that, and it's possible to do that. So it's all about positioning yourself and depositioning the other, right? And so that's the opportunity. And if you have a legitimate case and you can poke holes in the documentary or show where it's biased, then you should be prepared to do that.
And I think that's a good thing. And I don't know if either one of you have watched Making a Murderer, the Maker Murderer, a documentary that was popular probably, I don't know, 5 years ago or so, that about Stephen Avery and how everyone is justice for Stephen Avery. And the thing, going back to your point, Brent, about how things can be cut to really look biased one way or the other. I mean, I'll admit, after watching that, I thought he was completely set up. He was completely innocent and all this. But then you have, going back to what Sean was talking about, you have what's called Convicting a Murderer, which is out on Daily Wire, that Candace Owens produced or edited or whatever she ended up doing. She had her involvement in there. But she presents more of the other side, or more of a fuller picture of evidence that was left out of the documentary, evidence that wasn't necessarily presented in the documentary. And I got to tell you, after watching that, my opinion of whether or not he's guilty has changed. I think, but it's going back to a point where you have this really skewed narrative. And then when you get more piece to the puzzle, now you have a more fuller picture. Now you can make a decision. And if you still look at it and say he's innocent, then fine, but at least you've looked at both sides versus just having it be biased one way or the other.
Yeah. I think part of the issue is that the word documentary implies fairness, right? It implies that there's been, a team of investigators who have done their due diligence and have unearthed information that's, very viable and that people should hear, and that it's fair, and that it takes into account both sides, right? But that's why, you start by saying that's not a documentary, right? It's an opinion piece. And then explain why.
And and I think it goes back, talking about, winning the court of public opinion. Brent, we had talked about, Mike Lindell's deposition about when you win the court of public opinion versus whether or not you win the case. I want you to talk a little bit about how, as an attorney, you have to kind of balance those types of things too, because in your mind, you're thinking, oh my gosh, please stop. But in his mind, he's probably thinking, no, this is what I have to do to protect my brand.
In his mind, he wants you to know that those pillows are not lumpy, right?
That's right. I'll call them lumpy pillows.
So with it, as an attorney, I don't like for my clients to act in that manner when they're being deposed. If you haven't seen the footage, I would encourage you to go look at it on YouTube or whatever social media you want to see. It's entertaining for sure, but he was defending his company, right? He was defending the brand and the company. And I think for the people who are already on his side, it's like a rallying cry, right? It's like, yes, stand up for him, stand up for yourself. And so again, it's different because I come from a different place. I'm going to view his conduct there and his deposition testimony differently than who I think his intended audience was. I think they're going to like it.
Yeah. And I think that's another thing too, is where you think about intended audience, and you could go back to Trump, and it can go back to a lot of other people about, it's not necessarily about winning the legal case. It's about protecting the brand. But I think it also can be dangerous, though. I don't think it's a slippery slope, Brent, though, wouldn't you agree, into getting to normal everyday fact witnesses or, 30B6 that aren't going to go out on social media, that aren't well known, like Mike Lindell, to feel like they have to go in and try to defend and do the exact same thing too, because it's a different area.
100%. And even when it is time to, defend yourself in the public battle, right? Legal needs to be primary, right? That needs to be number one. And so that's the way I always operate. And to the extent that we are able to, without hurting our legal position, let's get the story out there.
Yeah. Sean, what are your thoughts on that, as far as, trying to win the battle, but you lose the legal battle, but you win the public battle?
Right. So I think Brent is right. I mean, first, that any litigation communication strategy is supposed to support the trial strategy, right? It's supposed to amplify the trial strategy and the messaging for the trial. my fear is that, people taking a look at the conduct and behavior of some of these people, uh, uh, thinking that should become the norm, right? And so, but I don't think what they're recognizing is kind of the special circumstance of these people and the situations that they're in. Um, you know, it's been said about Trump that his he has one strategy, basically, that the evidence, when you listen to the prosecutors, right, the ex-prosecutors, the evidence seems to be so overwhelming that his chance at trial is difficult. So his best opportunity is to become president again and make the federal cases at least go away, right? So, he hasn't said that, but, it would seem to be that that's the strategy that's at play right now, right? Because he is playing almost entirely to the court of public opinion. And sometimes it's reported against the advice of his lawyers, right? But look at the stakes there for the nation, for him, and look at his goal. So but so that's part of the reason why it's an exceptional case, and that others shouldn't feel that they're going to get the same treatment. I mean, you read and hear day after day that his postings are being challenged as threatening to witnesses and others, and it's always this caveat: anyone else would be like in jail, or anyone else would be suffering some sort of consequence from the judge, right? So I think that the larger issue is what is the impact on ordinary litigation and people, and thinking that this somehow might save them in their situation. And it's just not, there's not many like situations to that.
Yeah, agreed. Brent, I'll give you the last word on this too, because I think, you have a unique insight on that. Is what would be your kind of advice for attorneys who are having to go through these cases that potentially may have exposure, may have cameras, may have a lot of eyeballs on them? I mean, what would you tell them in order to how to approach it?
It takes a lot more diligence and a lot more time because, again, we talked about it's two battles, right? Normally you have one set of things to think about. You got to make sure those are taken care of, and then also go further when we're thinking about the media. Also, it's going to depend a lot on the temperament of your client, whether he or she can be on good behavior or not, and take instruction. They don't always do what we suggest they do. And so it's just being more prepared, even more prepared than some of the toughest cases you've had that did not involve that aspect.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. Like you said, you have some of them who won't take your advice and stuff. I guess you have an uphill battle to try to explain to them about how detrimental it could be to their case, though, for them to be like that, right? And maybe it's just it goes back to certain individuals where you say, I don't care, it's about protecting my brand, whether or not I lose millions, that's fine, because my perception, my public persona is more important.
It all depends on how big the name and the ego is. Not just the celebrities, some other people who are not in the limelight the same way.
Well, I think that's another point too, that we don't, it doesn't necessarily have to be about celebrities. It can be about other CEOs of large corporations, right? That may not necessarily be in the headlines, but their cases are in the headlines, and their personality, temperaments and stuff too are going to be a little bit strong, almost like the celebrities in that, and having to deal with those too. But having a game plan, to your point, understanding and how it can influence stakeholders, right, Sean? I mean, I think that's one other thing, just to close the loop on that, is stakeholders is one other important thing I don't think enough people talk about, right? Especially if you're CEOs or your heads of organizations, that how the litigation pans out could influence your business bottom line.
Without a doubt. And, a lot of CEOs are unaccustomed to being told no, right? Or to be put in situations where they're challenged. And so, yeah, I think you can get a reaction that undermines your case at times unless you listen to counsel and are really well prepared, right? Because what is at stake? Well, if you're a public company, it's all those institutions that own your company. And many of them are more forward thinking these days about social issues and other things. And so, they're going to be demanding of you that your company's conduct be, exemplary, right? And then there's your employees themselves. Again, in a world where people are getting information from lots of sources, what are they hearing about your company on social media, right? And how does it impact their performance? And what are they saying about your company? Are they repeating what you hope they would say about the company, or are they buying into a different narrative that is damaging to your company? You see a lot of labor unrest these days. A bunch of Starbucks workers walked out on Red Cup Day today, right? Because they're dissatisfied with what's going on with them and their company. So yes, you have to always take into account the impact of your conduct on your stakeholders and how they're going to hold you accountable.
Brent, do you have to monitor social media for your clients and stuff, as far as not monitor it to make sure they're not doing anything? But I mean, is it kind of one of the thought of yours to try to keep an eye on what's being said in social media about your clients?
We make sure we know what's going on. We don't necessarily tell people or companies how to manage their social media, but we don't want to get blindsided by something that's out there.
And that's more what I meant. Yeah, not necessarily saying from a legal perspective, don't say this. It's more or less, though, that you're informed about what the public narrative is being said about your clients, though. Have to in this day and age, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, I can talk for you guys for a little bit longer, but I think I'm going to cut you loose. I appreciate the conversation. I always enjoy having both of you on because I think you bring definitely different perspectives that I think can be useful for the listeners. So once again, Brent Turman, Bill Nunnally, appreciate it. Sean Murphy from Courtroom Sciences for our critical communications department. Appreciate both of you guys. Make sure you go to our website, courtroomsciences.com. All our blogs, posts, everything's up there. Feel free to reach out to any of us. If you need to get a hold of any of them, feel free to reach out to me and I can get a hold of them. This has been another edition of the Litigation Psychology Podcast brought to you by Courtroom Sciences.